When Captain Elena Vasquez brought down a burning C-130 Hercules through Taliban crossfire with both engines dead and 23 souls aboard that command had already declared lost, she proved that sometimes the most dangerous missions are flown by the pilots everyone calls expendable. But 72 hours before that impossible landing changed everything. They still called her just a cargo pilot and meant it as an insult. The duty roster at Bagram Airfield told Elena everything she needed to know about her place in the hierarchy. Her name was permanently assigned to milk runs and supply drops, printed in faded block letters under transport operations, non-combat. While fighter jocks got the glory missions and attack helicopter crews earned the medals, Elena flew toilet paper to forward operating bases and hauled equipment that nobody else wanted to touch. She'd been doing it for 8 months now, watching her flight academy classmates rotate through combat assignments while she accumulated endless hours of what the brass considered routine logistic support. Elena had graduated third in her class from flight school, held certifications in hostile environment operations, and could land a C-130 on improvised strips that would make seasoned pilots break into cold sweats. None of it mattered when promotion boards saw cargo transport and automatically relegated her accomplishments to footnotes. The morning briefing room at Bagram buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy. Pilots clustered around coffee urns and mission boards, checking weather updates and discussing routes through airspace that could turn deadly without warning. Elena sat in her assigned section, the corner reserved for transport crews, reviewing meteorological data with the kind of obsessive attention that combat pilots dismissed as overkill for simple cargo runs her weathered flight suit bore. None of the patches that marked elite units or dangerous missions. No prestigious squadron insignia, no combat decorations, just the basic aviation wings and a name tape that most officers on base couldn't match to a face. Elena had learned to be invisible in a profession where visibility often meant survival, where being overlooked was preferable to being noticed for the wrong reasons. She spread her charts across the scratched metal table, annotating wind patterns and threat assessments with meticulous precision. The Taliban had been increasing their anti-aircraft activity around the eastern provinces, and Elena tracked every reported SAM site, every instance of hostile fire, every piece of intelligence that might affect aircraft operating in contested airspace. It was information that could save lives, but nobody asked transport pilots for tactical analysis. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Stone emerged from the operations center with his usual swagger, commanding attention through presence alone. His dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every crease razor-sharp. Stone had flown F-16s before transitioning to base operations, and he carried himself like someone who'd never forgotten the difference between real pilots and those who simply moved cargo from point A to point B. He paused at Elena's table, his eyes scanning her weather charts with the kind of casual dismissal reserved for paperwork that wouldn't affect important decisions. "Vasquez," he said, his tone carrying that particular inflection officers used when addressing personnel they considered interchangeable. "I see you're still playing meteorologist. Hope all that homework doesn't interfere with your actual job." "Responsibilities." Elena looked up from her charts, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. "Just reviewing current conditions for today's supply run to FOB Mitchell, sir. The weather patterns suggest possible updrafts around the approach corridor." Stone sipped his coffee, making her wait for his response in the kind of power play that reminded everyone about rank and hierarchy. "The thing about weather, Vasquez, is that it's the same for everyone flying through it. The real pilots manage just fine without turning every flight into a college thesis project." The comment drew chuckles from nearby officers, the kind of casual mockery that kept subordinates in their place without crossing the line into actionable harassment. Elena felt the familiar weight of dismissal, the sense that her preparation and expertise were viewed as symptoms of inadequacy rather then signs of professionalism. "Yes, sir," she replied carefully. "Just want to make sure the medical supplies reach Mitchell on schedule." "Medical supplies that are going to the same destination they've been going for months," Stone said, stepping closer with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. FOB Mitchell isn't exactly a challenging run, even for transport crews. Straight flight path, secure airspace, friendly territory all the way. Probably could program an autopilot to handle it. Elena nodded once, her expression neutral despite the frustration building in her chest. She'd flown to Mitchell 17 times in the past 3 months, knew every landmark and potential hazard along the route. More importantly, she'd been tracking intelligence reports about increased Taliban activity in that sector, movements that suggested a coordinated effort to disrupt supply lines through exactly the kind of attacks that turned routine missions into disasters. Stone moved on to brief the fighter squadrons, his voice carrying renewed authority as he discussed missions that actually mattered. Elena remained at her table, studying weather patterns and threat assessments that would be dismissed as overthinking by people who'd never had to land a fully loaded transport aircraft under hostile fire. The hangar bay echoed with the familiar sounds of pre-flight preparation. Elena walked the length of her C-130, conducting her visual inspection with systematic thoroughness. Every rivet, every panel, every component that could fail at the worst possible moment received careful attention. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, worked alongside her with the kind of professional competence that came from understanding that second-rate maintenance could kill everyone aboard. "Bird's looking good, Captain," Santos reported, closing the engine cowling after completing her own inspection. "All systems green, fuel topped off, cargo secured according to manifest. Should be another routine run to Mitchell." Elena nodded, appreciating Santos's professionalism, even as she noted the assumption that any mission flown by cargo crews would automatically be routine. Nothing was routine in a combat zone, but that lesson usually came too late for the people who needed to learn it most. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena discovered the pattern 3 weeks before everything went to hell. It started with seemingly random incidents that most pilots dismissed as isolated events. A missed radio check here, unusual ground fire there, nothing that triggered formal threat assessments or changed operational procedures. But Elena tracked every anomaly, logged every deviation from normal patterns, and what she found kept her awake at night, studying maps under the harsh, fluorescent lights of her quarters. The Taliban were systematically probing cargo routes with the patience of hunters who understood their prey's habits. Elena spread intelligence reports across her desk, connecting dots that nobody else seemed interested in connecting. 3 transport helicopters had reported SAM radar locks along the eastern corridor in the past month. 2 C-130s had taken small arms fire during what should have been secure approaches to forward operating bases. A Chinook carrying medical supplies had been forced to abort its landing at FOB Mitchell after mortar rounds bracketed the landing zone with suspicious accuracy. Individually, these incidents looked like random harassment from an enemy that occasionally got lucky. Together, they painted a picture of coordinated reconnaissance, enemy forces learning the timing and routes of supply missions while testing response times and defensive capabilities. Elena cross-referenced the incidents with cargo manifests and discovered another disturbing pattern. The Taliban were specifically targeting medical supplies and ammunition shipments, the high-value cargo that kept isolated outposts functional. She pulled up satellite imagery on her laptop, studying terrain features around FOB Mitchell with the intensity of someone planning a combat mission rather than a routine supply run. The base sat in a valley surrounded by ridgelines that offered perfect observation points for enemy spotters. Recent photos showed increased activity around those ridges, new fighting positions, communication equipment, and what appeared to be mobile anti-aircraft systems being moved into positions that commanded the approach routes. Elena printed out her analysis and prepared a formal intelligence summary, documenting patterns that suggested an imminent coordinated attack on supply lines. The evidence was compelling to anyone willing to examine it objectively, but she knew from experience that objectivity was often the first casualty of institutional bias. Transport crews weren't supposed to conduct intelligence analysis, weren't expected to think strategically about enemy intentions, and certainly weren't qualified to question operational security decisions made by people with more rank and less time in cockpits. The base intelligence office was located in a concrete bunker that smelled like stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Elena waited outside the duty officer's office, her intelligence summary clutched in hands that remained steady despite the importance of what she was trying to communicate. Major Robert Fletcher emerged from his office, carrying a stack of reports and the expression of someone dealing with endless interruptions to more important work. "Vasquez," he said without enthusiasm, "what can I do for you?" Elena handed him her analysis, watching his face as he scanned the executive summary. "Sir, I've identified patterns in recent enemy activity that suggest coordinated surveillance of our supply routes. I believe they're planning a major operation against transport missions, particularly medical and ammunition resupply flights." Fletcher flipped through the pages with the kind of cursory attention that suggested predetermined conclusions. "This is interesting work, Captain, but intelligence analysis isn't really in your lane. We have dedicated personnel who monitor threat patterns and assess enemy capabilities." "Yes, sir, but I've been flying these routes regularly and I'm seeing things that might not be apparent from traditional intelligence sources. The timing of these incidents correlates directly with our published supply schedules." Fletcher closed the folder and handed it back to her with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Published schedules that are classified and constantly changed for operational security reasons. I think you're seeing patterns that aren't really there, Captain. It's natural for pilots to be cautious, but overthinking routine missions can be just as dangerous as undertaking them." Elena felt the familiar frustration of expertise being dismissed by people who'd never flown the missions they were evaluating. "Sir, respectfully, these aren't routine missions anymore. Enemy activity has increased by 300% along the Mitchell corridor in the past 3 weeks. They're positioning assets to intercept our aircraft." "Captain," Fletcher said, his voice taking on the patient tone of authority, addressing persistent subordinates, "cargo pilots see threats everywhere because that's what cargo pilots do. Fighter pilots see targets, attack pilots see objectives, and transport crews see dangers that usually turn out to be shadows and weather patterns. The intelligence professionals who analyze these threats have access to resources and information that go far beyond what you can observe from a cockpit window." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Elena recognized the subtle signs, the way Fletcher shifted his weight toward his office door, the manner in which he held her folder like it was contaminated, the tone that indicated the conversation was over, regardless of what additional evidence she might present. She'd encountered this reaction before, the institutional assumption that transport crews were inherently overcautious because they lacked the aggressive mindset required for real combat operations. Elena returned to her quarters with her intelligence summary intact and her warnings unheeded. She spread the satellite photos across her desk again, studying terrain features and enemy positions with renewed urgency. The evidence was even more compelling when viewed in sequence, a clear progression of Taliban forces moving into positions that would allow them to coordinate attacks on multiple supply routes. Simultaneously, she opened her laptop and began updating her threat assessment, incorporating new intelligence that had arrived since her meeting with Fletcher. 2 more incidents had been reported in the past 24 hours. A Danish C-130 had taken RPG fire during its approach to a forward base. And a British Chinook had aborted its mission after ground spotters reported suspicious activity around the landing zone. The pattern was accelerating, building towards something that would overwhelm the scattered defenses of isolated outposts that depended entirely on air resupply for survival. Elena pulled out her flight charts and began marking enemy positions with red ink, creating a tactical picture that would have horrified anyone willing to examine it objectively. The Taliban had effectively surrounded the supply corridors with overlapping fields of fire, turning routine cargo runs into potential death traps for aircrew who believed they were flying safe missions through secured airspace. Elena tried again. The next morning, this time requesting a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Stone himself. The operations center hummed with pre-dawn activity as duty officers reviewed overnight intelligence reports and coordinated the day's flight schedules. Stone stood at the central planning table, surrounded by squadron leaders and operations specialists who deferred to his judgment on matters that could affect hundreds of personnel, scattered across a dozen forward bases. "Sir," Elena began, approaching the group with her updated threat assessment in hand, "I need to brief you on significant changes in enemy activity patterns that could affect today's supply missions." Stone looked up from the mission board with an expression that suggested mild annoyance at being interrupted by concerns that should have been handled at lower levels. "Vasquez, I thought Major Fletcher addressed your intelligence concerns yesterday. Is there something specific about today's cargo manifest that requires command attention?" The question was designed to put her in her place, reminding everyone present that cargo pilots dealt with manifests while real officers handled strategic planning. Elena felt the weight of eyes turning toward their conversation, operations personnel, pausing their work to witness what would either be a quick dismissal or an embarrassing scene. "Sir, the Taliban have positioned anti-aircraft assets to coordinate attacks on our supply routes. I have photographic evidence and pattern analysis showing systematic preparation for major operations against transport aircraft," Elena offered. The folder containing her latest intelligence compilation. Stone accepted the folder but didn't open it, holding it like evidence of her inability to understand her proper role in the chain of command. "Captain, let me explain something about intelligence analysis. It requires training in threat assessment, access to classified information sources, and the experience to distinguish between enemy capabilities and enemy intentions. Transport pilots see aircraft getting shot at and assume there's some master plan behind it." Murmurs rippled through the assembled officers, some showing sympathy for Elena's position, while others demonstrated the kind of discomfort that came from witnessing professional boundaries being publicly enforced. Stone continued his explanation with the patient tone of someone educating a subordinate who'd overstepped her qualifications. "The incidents you're tracking are harassment operations, Captain. Random potshots from an enemy that occasionally gets lucky with small arms fire or crude rockets. If there was a coordinated threat to our supply operations, it would be identified and neutralized by people who specialize in counterintelligence operations." Elena felt her professional composure beginning to crack under the weight of institutional dismissal. "Sir, respectfully, I've flown combat zones for 6 years. I know the difference between random harassment and coordinated surveillance. These positions are being occupied in sequence, creating overlapping fields of fire that will allow—" "Captain," Stone interrupted, his voice dropping to the register that every officer in the building recognized as dangerous territory. "Are you suggesting that our intelligence professionals have missed something that's obvious to a cargo pilot? Are you questioning the competence of people who've devoted their careers to understanding enemy capabilities?" The silence that followed was profound and electric. Elena realized she'd crossed an invisible line, challenging not just Stone's authority, but the entire institutional hierarchy that placed specialists above generalists and combat operations. Above support functions. Everyone in the operations center understood the implications of this moment. A transport pilot was publicly questioning the intelligence apparatus that kept them all alive. "No, sir," Elena said carefully. "I'm reporting observations from someone who flies these routes daily and has direct exposure to changing threat patterns." Stone handed her folder back without opening it, the gesture carrying more dismissal than any words could convey. "Captain Vasquez, your dedication to mission safety is admirable, but your analysis is based on incomplete information and limited perspective. The professionals who monitor these threats have access to signals intelligence, human intelligence, and satellite reconnaissance that provides a complete tactical picture. What looks like coordination to you might be completely unrelated incidents that happen to occur in the same geographic area." Elena accepted the folder with hands that remained steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Understood, sir." "I hope so," Stone continued, his voice carrying enough authority to ensure their conversation would be repeated throughout the base by evening. "Because second-guessing intelligence assessments based on pilot observations can be dangerous for everyone involved. It creates unnecessary anxiety about missions that are already planned and coordinated, according to proper threat evaluation procedures." The dismissal was surgical in its precision, delivered with enough public witness to ensure that Elena's concerns would be labeled as overcautiousness rather than legitimate intelligence. Stone turned back to the mission planning table, already shifting his attention to matters that required command decisions rather than individual pilot concerns. Elena walked toward the exit, her intelligence summary tucked under her arm like evidence of professional overreach that would follow her throughout her career. Behind her, she could hear Stone resuming the morning briefing, his voice carrying renewed authority now that the challenge to institutional competence had been publicly addressed. As she reached the door, Elena heard him announce the day's mission priorities with confidence that suggested no awareness of threats beyond those identified through official channels. Transport operations continue on schedule to all forward bases. Weather is optimal, threat levels remain minimal, and all cargo flights are cleared for standard approach procedures. Elena's persistence became a problem that demanded administrative solutions. Word spread quickly through the tight community of aviators that the cargo pilot was pushing intelligence theories that contradicted official threat assessments. What had started as professional disagreement evolved into something more personal, a challenge to the competence of people whose careers depended on never being wrong about matters of life and death. Captain James Morrison cornered Elena in the pilot's lounge 3 days after her meeting with Stone, his approach carrying the casual aggression of someone delivering an unofficial message from higher authority. Morrison flew Black Hawks for special operations, wore the patches and decorations that marked him as elite, and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never been dismissed or ignored. "Heard you've been playing amateur spy again, Vasquez," Morrison said, settling into the chair across from her with territorial familiarity. "Making waves about Taliban coordination theories and threat assessments. Some people are wondering if cargo duty is getting to your head." Elena looked up from her flight manual, recognizing the opening move in a campaign designed to isolate her from peer support. "Just reporting observations, Morrison. Same as any pilot would do after noticing unusual patterns." Morrison laughed with the kind of humor that carried no warmth. "Unusual patterns? That's rich coming from someone who flies the same milk run 3 times a week. You've been to Mitchell so many times you probably see threats in your sleep. Maybe it's time to request some leave, clear your head before you start seeing Taliban conspiracies and cloud formations." The suggestion wasn't casual advice between colleagues. Elena understood the subtext. Her continued warnings were being interpreted as symptoms of stress-related paranoia, the kind of professional deterioration that ended careers through medical channels rather than disciplinary action. It was a more elegant solution than formal charges. allowing command to remove a troublesome pilot while maintaining the appearance of concern for her welfare. Elena tried a different approach the following day, requesting a meeting with the base medical officer to report her intelligence concerns through healthcare channels. Dr. Sarah Williams listened to Elena's briefing with professional attention, taking notes as Elena presented her evidence of coordinated Taliban surveillance and positioning around supply routes. "This is concerning information, Captain," Dr. Williams said after reviewing Elena's documentation. "But I'm not qualified to evaluate tactical intelligence. Have you presented these findings to the appropriate intelligence personnel?" "Yes, ma'am. Multiple times through different channels. Each time my concerns have been dismissed as pilot overcautiousness or stress-related anxiety. I'm hoping that a medical perspective might carry more weight with command authority." Dr. Williams studied Elena with the analytical gaze of someone trained to recognize psychological stress in combat personnel. "Captain, you've been flying combat missions for 8 months without rotation. That's longer than recommended for transport crews operating in hostile environments. Extended exposure to threat assessment responsibilities can create hypervigilance that affects judgment." Elena felt the conversation shifting from intelligence evaluation to psychological assessment, another institutional mechanism for neutralizing personnel who raised inconvenient concerns. "Ma'am, respectfully, this isn't about stress or hypervigilance. The evidence clearly shows. The evidence shows a pilot who's been analyzing threats beyond her area of responsibility and finding patterns that intelligence professionals haven't identified." Dr. Williams interrupted gently. "That kind of analytical obsession can be a symptom of deployment-related stress disorder. I'd like to schedule you for a comprehensive psychological evaluation." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Elena could accept the psychological evaluation and risk being grounded for mental health concerns, or she could refuse and have her fitness for duty questioned through other channels. Either path led to her removal from flight status, eliminating her ability to observe the patterns she'd been tracking or warn anyone about the threats she'd identified. Elena's final attempt came through the chaplain's office, requesting a meeting with Chaplain Colonel Robert Hayes on grounds of moral and ethical concerns about mission safety. Hayes listened to her intelligence summary with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing confessions and personal crises from personnel under extreme stress. "Captain, this is clearly weighing heavily on your conscience," Hayes said, after Elena finished her presentation. "But I'm wondering if your concerns might be rooted in fear rather than genuine intelligence indicators. Transport pilots face unique psychological pressures that can manifest as excessive threat perception." "Sir, I'm not reporting fears or impressions. I'm documenting systematic enemy preparation for coordinated attacks on our supply lines. The evidence is objective and verifiable." Hayes nodded with pastoral sympathy. "Evidence that's been reviewed by qualified intelligence professionals who found no cause for alarm." Sometimes our desire to contribute beyond our assigned roles can create situations where we see significance in random events. It's a natural response to feeling undervalued or overlooked. The conversation had transformed Elena's intelligence concerns into a psychological profile, reducing her professional observations to symptoms of personal inadequacy and role dissatisfaction. Hayes recommended counseling sessions to help her accept her assigned responsibilities without feeling compelled to exceed her authority or expertise. Elena left the chaplain's office understanding that every official channel had been closed to her concerns. Her warnings had been reframed as evidence of stress, ambition, or psychological instability. The institutional response was complete and coordinated. Any further attempts to raise alarm about Taliban preparations would be met with formal action to remove her from flight status permanently. She walked back to her quarters through the evening heat, carrying intelligence that could save lives, but had been systematically dismissed by every level of command authority. The Taliban continued their preparations while the people responsible for countering those preparations convinced themselves that the threats didn't exist because acknowledging them would mean admitting that a cargo pilot had identified patterns that professional intelligence officers had missed. Elena retreated into solitary preparation, working through scenarios that everyone else refused to acknowledge. Her quarters became a makeshift intelligence center, walls covered with maps annotated in different colored inks to track enemy movements and supply route vulnerabilities. She cross-referenced Taliban activity patterns with meteorological data, understanding that coordination required more than just positioning. It demanded timing that would maximize the impact of simultaneous attacks. The night shifts became her sanctuary, hours when she could work without attracting attention from personnel who'd already labeled her as problematic. Elena studied every piece of intelligence that crossed her desk through routine channels, looking for confirmations of the patterns she'd identified. Supply requisition forms revealed which forward bases were requesting emergency medical supplies. Maintenance reports showed increased aircraft damage from small arms fire. Communication logs documented radio interruptions and jamming attempts that suggested sophisticated enemy electronic warfare capabilities. She began modifying her personal equipment loadout, adding items that weren't standard for routine cargo missions but could prove essential during emergency operations. Extra survival gear went into her flight vest alongside additional medical supplies and emergency communication equipment. Elena tested every piece of gear repeatedly, ensuring that stress and combat conditions wouldn't reveal equipment failures. At critical moments, her C-130 received unofficial upgrades disguised as routine maintenance procedures. Elena worked with Staff Sergeant Santos during off-duty hours, installing additional defensive countermeasures and upgrading communication systems that could function despite enemy jamming efforts. The modifications violated several regulations about unauthorized aircraft alterations, but Elena understood that survival often required breaking rules that had been written by people who'd never faced the situations those rules were supposed to address. Santos proved to be Elena's only reliable ally, sharing her concerns about increased threat activity without questioning her competence or psychological stability. The veteran crew chief had served 3 combat deployments and possessed enough experience to recognize genuine threats despite official assurances about mission safety. "Captain, I've been tracking maintenance reports from other transport units," Santos said during one of their late-night preparation sessions. "Battle damage is up 400% across all cargo aircraft operating in the eastern sectors. Either we're flying into more hostile territory or the enemy is getting better at hitting us." Elena nodded grimly, appreciating Santos's practical approach to threat assessment. Both, probably. They're positioning assets to create overlapping fields of fire, while our people convince themselves that increased casualties are just statistical anomalies. Santos installed additional armor plating around critical systems, work that would normally require engineering approval and formal modification procedures. The extra weight would affect fuel consumption and flight performance, but Elena calculated that survivability outweighed efficiency when flying through coordinated ambush zones that intelligence officers refused to acknowledge. Elena's flight training intensified during off-duty hours as she practiced emergency procedures that weren't part of standard cargo pilot curriculum. She spent hours in the simulator running scenarios that combined multiple system failures with hostile fire and adverse weather conditions. Engine failures during combat maneuvering, hydraulic system damage while conducting evasive action, emergency landings in contested territory, situations that would never occur during routine supply missions but could become necessary when routine missions encountered extraordinary circumstances. The base flight surgeon, Major Patricia Collins, noticed Elena's increased simulator time and requested an informal consultation about pilot stress indicators. Elena met with Collins in her office, recognizing another attempt to medicalize her professional concerns and remove her from flight status through mental health channels. "Captain, your flight training hours have increased significantly over the past month," Collins observed, reviewing Elena's training records. "Excessive preparation can sometimes indicate anxiety about routine duties. Are you experiencing concerns about your ability to perform assigned missions?" Elena chose her words carefully, understanding that any admission of stress or uncertainty would be documented and potentially used to justify grounding her. "Ma'am, I believe in maintaining proficiency across all possible flight scenarios. Combat environments can change rapidly, and preparation prevents panic." Collins made notes in Elena's file while maintaining the concerned expression of someone evaluating fitness for duty. "Captain, transport pilots typically don't require extensive combat maneuvering training. Your assigned missions follow established routes through secured airspace. Perhaps this additional training indicates subconscious fears about mission safety. Ma'am, I prefer to be prepared for situations that might never occur, rather than unprepared for situations that could develop without warning." Elena's response was measured, avoiding any language that could be interpreted as admission of excessive anxiety or paranoia. The medical evaluation concluded without formal action, but Elena understood that her increased training had been noted and flagged as potentially symptomatic of stress-related performance deterioration. One more unofficial mark against her competence that could be used to justify her removal if her warnings continued to embarrass command authority. Elena maintained her preparation, despite institutional pressure to conform to lower standards expected from cargo pilots. Her intelligence files grew thicker with evidence of coordinated Taliban activity. Her aircraft became more capable of surviving hostile encounters that weren't supposed to happen during routine missions. Her crew developed capabilities that exceeded standard requirements for transport operations. Most importantly, Elena prepared psychologically for the moment when institutional denial would collide with battlefield reality. When that moment arrived, and she knew it would arrive soon, she would be ready to respond with capabilities that everyone else had dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. From an overly cautious pilot who didn't understand her place in the military hierarchy, the attack began at 0647 hours on a Tuesday morning that had started like every other routine supply mission. Elena was completing her pre-flight checklist when the first emergency transmission crackled through the base communication system, a broken voice fighting through static and the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Hawk 7-3, taking heavy fire on approach to Mitchell. Multiple SAN launches were hit, losing altitude." The transmission dissolved into electronic chaos, leaving behind a silence that felt like the moment before thunder follows lightning. The operations center erupted into controlled panic as duty officers scrambled to establish contact with the missing Chinook helicopter that had been carrying critical medical supplies to FOB Mitchell. Elena listened to the frantic radio calls from her cockpit, her hands frozen on the controls as she realized that Hawk 7-3 had flown directly into the coordinated ambush she'd been warning about for weeks. More emergency transmissions followed in rapid succession, painting a picture of systematic destruction that validated every pattern Elena had identified in her dismissed intelligence reports. A Danish C-130 reported missile lock warnings during its approach to forward operating base Phoenix. A British Lynx helicopter aborted its landing at FOB Shepherd after taking RPG fire from multiple positions. 2 American Black Hawks conducting medical preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Evacuation missions found themselves trapped in a valley where Taliban forces had established overlapping fields of fire. Lieutenant Colonel Stone's voice cut through the communication chaos, demanding situation reports and coordination that couldn't Overcome the reality of simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors. All stations, this is base operations. I need immediate status updates from all aircraft operating in the Eastern Corridor. Report your positions and threat assessments. The responses revealed the scope of the disaster Elena had predicted. 7. Aircraft were either down, damaged, or trapped in positions where Taliban forces had spent weeks preparing coordinated ambushes. Supply lines to forward operating bases had been severed in a single morning, leaving isolated outposts without resupply capabilities and wounded personnel without evacuation options. Elena's radio crackled with a direct transmission from FOB Mitchell, the voice tight with barely controlled desperation. Any station, this is Mitchell Control. We have multiple casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Primary LZ is compromised, taking sustained mortar fire. Request emergency extraction capabilities. She keyed her microphone, knowing that offering assistance would violate her grounding orders, but unable to remain silent while people died. Mitchell Control, this is Cargo 77. I have medical evacuation capabilities and current intelligence. On threat positions, what's your tactical situation? Cargo 77, we have 17 wounded, including 2 critical cases that won't survive without immediate surgical intervention. Enemy forces have established fire positions around all approaches to our base. Previous extraction attempts have been driven off by coordinated SAM and RPG fire. Elena studied her tactical charts, overlaying the enemy positions she'd been tracking with the reported locations of hostile fire. The pattern was exactly what she'd predicted. Taliban forces had positioned themselves to create killing zones around critical approach routes, turning routine flights into gauntlets that conventional aircraft couldn't survive. Base operations interrupted the transmission with Stone's voice carrying command authority and mounting frustration. All aircraft are ordered to maintain safe distances from hostile contact. No unauthorized rescue attempts will be permitted until intelligence assessment determines viable extraction options. Elena switched to a discrete frequency and continued her conversation with Mitchell Control, knowing that official channels had failed but unwilling to abandon personnel who needed immediate assistance. Mitchell Control, what's the status of? You're wounded? Can they survive transport in a tactical environment? Negative, Cargo 77. 2 casualties have penetrating abdominal wounds requiring surgical stabilization. Moving them without medical facilities will result in fatalities. We need full medical evacuation with surgical capabilities. The situation was deteriorating beyond the ability of standard procedures to address. Elena listened to Stone coordinating with higher headquarters, requesting airstrikes and additional resources that would take hours to authorize and deploy. Meanwhile, wounded personnel were bleeding out in positions that couldn't be reached through conventional means. Major Fletcher's voice joined the communication network, his intelligence assessment delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything important. Base operations preliminary analysis indicates isolated enemy harassment rather than coordinated operations. Recommend standard defensive protocols while we develop intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. Elena stared at her radio, in disbelief, listening to Fletcher describe the systematic destruction of multiple aircraft as isolated harassment, while Taliban forces demonstrated exactly the coordination she'd been documenting for weeks. Intelligence professionals continued to deny patterns that had already produced catastrophic results, maintaining institutional positions even as their analysis proved deadly wrong. She made her decision with the clarity that came from watching predictions become reality while official responses remained trapped in denial and bureaucracy. Elena began her engine startup sequence, knowing that unauthorized action would end her career, but understanding that some missions transcended orders. regulations, and the career concerns of people who prioritized protocol over human life. Taliban had executed their coordinated attack with precision that surprised no one except the intelligence officers who'd refused to acknowledge the threat. Now Elena would execute her own unauthorized mission with capabilities that everyone had dismissed as unnecessary paranoia from an overly cautious cargo pilot. Elena's C-130 lifted off from Bagram without clearance, her engines spinning up to combat power as she banked toward the eastern mountains where conventional rescue efforts had already failed. The control tower erupted in urgent transmissions demanding her immediate return. But Elena switched to emergency frequencies and continued her climb toward the coordinated ambush zones that had trapped multiple aircraft and left wounded personnel dying in positions beyond the reach of authorized assistance. Stone's voice cut through the radio. Chaos with command authority and barely controlled rage. Cargo 77, you are ordered to return to base immediately. You do not have clearance for combat operations, and you are violating direct orders from base command. Elena keyed her microphone with deliberate calm, knowing that her next words would end her military career but might save lives that official channels had already written off. Base operations, I have medical evacuation capabilities and current intelligence on enemy positions. Personnel at Mitchell require immediate assistance that isn't coming through authorized channels. Captain Vasquez, you are a cargo pilot operating unauthorized aircraft in hostile territory. You lack training for combat rescue operations, and you're endangering yourself and your aircraft without contributing meaningful assistance to tactical situations beyond your qualifications. The dismissal was automatic institutional reflex that prioritized procedure over problem solving, even when procedures had already failed catastrophically. Elena climbed through 8,000 feet and studied her tactical display, watching radar contacts that represented Taliban positions she'd been tracking for weeks. While official intelligence continued to deny their existence, her radio crackled with another desperate transmission from FOB Mitchell, the base commander's voice tight with professional desperation. Any station capable of medical evacuation. This is Mitchell Actual. We have 2 casualties requiring immediate surgical intervention. Time critical for survival. All previous extraction attempts have been unsuccessful due to coordinated enemy fire. Elena switched to the discrete frequency she'd established with Mitchell during her earlier reconnaissance missions, bypassing official channels that had proven incapable of coordinating effective responses. Mitchell Actual, this is your medical transport. I have current intelligence on enemy positions and equipment capable of operating in your tactical environment. What's your landing zone status? Medical transport. All standard LG are compromised by direct fire weapons. Enemy has established overlapping fields of fire using positions they've occupied over the past 3 weeks. We need alternative extraction options. Elena consulted the terrain maps she'd been studying obsessively, identifying approach routes that avoided the Taliban positions she'd documented through unauthorized reconnaissance. Her analysis had revealed a narrow valley approach that enemy forces couldn't observe directly, a route that required precise navigation through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain pilots flying under ideal conditions. Mitchell Actual, I can attempt extraction using unconventional approach vectors. Prepare your casualties for immediate transport and establish perimeter security around grid reference 687 to 432. Mark the alternate LZ with infrared strobes and prepare for tactical extraction under hostile fire. Base operations interrupted with increasingly urgent demands for Elena's return. Threats of court-martial proceedings mixing with warnings about combat operations beyond her training and qualifications. Major Fletcher's voice joined the transmission. Network, his intelligence assessment delivered with confidence that ignored the reality of ongoing Taliban coordination. Cargo 77, Current intelligence indicates enemy forces lack sophisticated air defense capabilities. Your concerns about coordinated attacks are based on incomplete threat analysis. Return to base and allow qualified personnel to handle tactical situations. Elena stared at her radio in amazement, listening to Fletcher deny coordinated enemy capabilities while Taliban forces demonstrated exactly the sophistication she'd been documenting. Intelligence officers continued maintaining positions that had already proven wrong while refusing to acknowledge evidence that contradicted their institutional assumptions. She switched off the command frequency and focused on navigation through terrain that would test every skill she'd developed during unauthorized training sessions. The valley approach required threading between ridgelines where Taliban spotters might be positioned, maintaining low altitude to avoid radar detection while staying high, enough to clear obstacles that could destroy her aircraft if encountered at combat speeds. Staff, Sergeant Santos's voice came through the intercom with professional calm that masked the stress of flying into combat zones without escort or backup support. Captain, we're approaching the threat envelope. Electronic warfare equipment is detecting multiple radar emissions consistent with portable SAM systems. Elena acknowledged the warning while adjusting her approach vector to exploit terrain, masking that would minimize exposure to enemy fire. Her aircraft carried the defensive modifications she'd installed during months of preparation, countermeasures that weren't standard for cargo aircraft, but could prove essential when conventional rules no longer applied to unconventional situations. Taliban had established their ambush with precision that validated every warning Elena had submitted through official channels. Now she would test whether individual preparation could overcome institutional failure, whether one pilot's unauthorized expertise could succeed where official responses had failed completely. Mitchell's casualties were running out of time while command authority remained paralyzed by procedures that couldn't address situations outside normal parameters. Elena committed to the approach that everyone said was impossible, flown by someone they'd dismissed as unqualified, attempting rescue that authorized personnel had declared beyond their capabilities. Elena's approach through the valley demanded navigation skills that cargo pilots supposedly didn't possess, threading between ridgelines where Taliban spotters had established observation posts designed to coordinate attacks on aircraft following predictable routes. She flew at 200 feet above ground level, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection while maintaining enough altitude to clear obstacles that could destroy her aircraft if encountered at tactical speeds. The first SAM launch came from the northern ridge, exactly where her intelligence reports had predicted enemy positioning. Elena saw the missile trail rising through her peripheral vision and immediately initiated defensive maneuvers that weren't part of standard cargo pilot training, diving toward the valley floor while deploying chaff and flare countermeasures that Santos had installed during their unauthorized modification sessions. SAM launch, 2 o'clock high. Santos reported through the intercom with professional calm that masked the stress of watching surface-to-air missiles track their aircraft, defensive systems engaging automatically. Elena pulled the C-130 through a series of evasive maneuvers that pushed the aircraft beyond normal operational parameters, using techniques she'd practiced during countless simulator sessions that everyone had dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. The missile detonated harmlessly behind them, close enough to rattle the airframe but far enough away to avoid critical damage. Her radio erupted with Taliban communications, intercepted by the electronic warfare equipment Santos had integrated into their defensive systems. Elena listened to enemy coordinators directing additional missile teams toward her position, their professional efficiency confirming the sophisticated command structure she'd been documenting, while intelligence officers insisted Taliban forces lacked coordination capabilities. A second missile launch forced Elena into a diving turn that brought them dangerously close to the rocky valley walls, her wingtips clearing stone outcroppings by margins that would have terrified pilots who hadn't spent months preparing for exactly these conditions. The proximity to terrain provided protection from radar-guided weapons while creating new hazards that required split-second navigation decisions. Small arms fire from multiple positions, Santos reported as tracer rounds began streaming past their cockpit windows. Enemy forces are tracking our movement and coordinating fire from prepared positions. Elena adjusted her approach vector to exploit blind spots in the Taliban defensive network, using intelligence she'd gathered through unauthorized reconnaissance to identify routes that enemy forces couldn't observe or engage effectively. Her analysis had revealed a narrow corridor where overlapping fields of fire created a gap that aircraft could exploit if they knew exactly where to look. The approach to FOB Mitchell required descending through a gauntlet of coordinated fire from positions that intelligence officers had declared non-existent. Elena committed to the landing with complete focus on the capabilities she developed through preparation that everyone had labeled excessive, flying by instruments and experience when visual references became meaningless through smoke and hostile fire. Mitchell's landing zone materialized through the haze as a small cleared area, surrounded by defensive positions and casualty collection points, where wounded personnel waited for evacuation that had been declared impossible by people who'd never attempted it. Elena aligned her aircraft with the improvised runway, while Taliban mortar began impacting around the base perimeter, their accuracy suggesting forward observers who'd been studying the facility for weeks. Ground fire intensified as Elena flared for landing, her aircraft taking multiple hits from small arms and light automatic weapons that enemy forces had positioned to engage aircraft during their most vulnerable phase of flight. Sparks flew from damaged systems while warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, but the modifications Santos had installed kept critical systems operational despite battle damage. The C-130 touched down hard on the unimproved surface, Elena fighting crosswinds and battle damage while maintaining control of an aircraft that had exceeded every operational parameter cargo pilots were supposed to encounter. She reversed thrust and applied maximum braking, bringing the damaged aircraft to a stop within the defensive perimeter that Mitchell's personnel had established around their improvised landing zone. Engines running, were taking fire from multiple directions, Elena announced through her radio while Mitchell's personnel began loading wounded casualties with desperate efficiency. "I need those wounded aboard in less than 3 minutes, or we're all staying here permanently." The evacuation proceeded with military precision despite incoming fire that forced everyone to work while taking cover behind the aircraft's bulk. Elena watched Mitchell's medical personnel load stretchers containing casualties who would have died without immediate surgical intervention. Personnel whose lives had been written off by command authorities unwilling to authorize rescue operations. Through hostile territory, Santos coordinated the loading process, while monitoring defensive systems that continued detecting incoming missiles and tracking radar from Taliban positions that officially didn't exist according to intelligence assessments. Elena prepared for a takeoff that would be even more dangerous than her landing. Knowing that enemy forces had now identified her aircraft and were repositioning weapons for maximum effectiveness against her departure, Taliban commanders coordinated their attack with professional competence that confirmed every pattern Elena had identified through analysis that intelligence officers had dismissed as pilot paranoia. Now those same patterns would determine whether her unauthorized rescue mission succeeded or became another casualty statistic that validated institutional assumptions about missions. Beyond cargo pilot capabilities, Elena's takeoff role began under direct fire from Taliban positions that had repositioned during the brief ground time. Enemy forces demonstrating exactly the tactical flexibility intelligence officers insisted they lacked. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit as she advanced the throttles to maximum power. The overloaded C-130 struggling to gain flying speed while carrying 17 wounded personnel. whose combined weight exceeded normal passenger capacity, taking hits in the cargo compartment. Santos reported through the intercom as small arms fire punctured the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. Medical personnel are treating casualties while we're under fire. Some of these wounds are critical. They won't survive if we don't reach surgical facilities within the hour. Elena pulled the aircraft off the ground at minimum flying speed, trading altitude for airspeed while staying below the ridgeline that concealed Taliban SAM positions. Her unauthorized modifications proved essential as defensive systems automatically deployed countermeasures against missile locks that painted her aircraft from multiple directions. Enemy air defense crews coordinating their engagement with professional precision. The left engine coughed and lost power as shrapnel from a near-miss explosion damaged the intake system, forcing Elena to compensate with asymmetric thrust while maintaining control of an aircraft operating at the edge of its performance envelope. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel as damaged systems struggled to function under combat conditions that cargo aircraft weren't designed to survive. Engine 2 showing fluctuating parameters, Santos announced while monitoring. Systems that had taken battle damage but remained marginally operational. Oil pressure dropping, exhaust gas temperature climbing. We're losing power faster than normal fuel consumption would indicate. Elena adjusted her flight path to follow the escape route she'd planned during months of studying terrain maps and enemy positions, exploiting valleys and ridgelines that would provide cover from Taliban observation posts while staying within gliding distance of emergency landing sites. Her navigation required precise timing and positioning that demonstrated exactly the expertise everyone had dismissed as unnecessary for cargo operations. Taliban radio communications revealed their frustration as Elena's aircraft disappeared into terrain features that enemy spotters couldn't observe effectively. She listened to coordination attempts between SAM sites and observation posts, understanding the enemy command structure well enough to predict their repositioning efforts and adjust her route accordingly. A hydraulic failure warning illuminated as battle damage affected the flight control systems, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control as backup systems struggled to maintain functionality. Elena fought the controls with physical strength while Santos worked to isolate damaged components and reroute critical systems through alternate pathways that their modifications had provided. Hydraulic system failure affecting primary flight controls, Santos reported with professional calm that masked the severity of their situation. We're flying on backup systems that weren't designed for extended operation. Control authority is degrading progressively. Elena's radio crackled with transmissions from Bagram as base operations tracked her return flight through radar contacts and communication intercepts that revealed the scope of her unauthorized mission. Stone's voice carried a mixture of rage and disbelief as he processed reports that contradicted every assumption about cargo pilot capabilities and Taliban coordination. Cargo 77, you have violated direct orders and endangered personnel through reckless action. Report your aircraft status and passenger manifest immediately. Elena keyed her microphone while wrestling with flight controls that responded sluggishly to her inputs, the damaged aircraft requiring constant adjustment to maintain heading and altitude. Base operations, I have 17 casualties aboard, requiring immediate medical attention. Request priority clearance for emergency medical landing. You have conducted unauthorized combat operations in violation of standing orders. Your actions have endangered military personnel and compromised operational security through unauthorized intelligence gathering and tactical assessment. The institutional response remained focused on regulatory violations while Elena flew a battle-damaged aircraft carrying wounded personnel who would die without immediate surgical intervention. She switched to emergency frequencies and continued her approach to Bagram, knowing that medical personnel would be standing by regardless of command's position on her unauthorized mission. Santos managed to restore partial hydraulic pressure through emergency procedures that bought them enough control authority to attempt a landing, though the approach would require precision flying with degraded systems and battle damage that affected every aspect of aircraft performance. Elena lined up with Bagram's runway while monitoring engine parameters that indicated imminent failure of critical systems. The landing approach demanded skills that cargo pilots supposedly didn't possess, compensating for battle damage and system failures while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid stalling with an overloaded aircraft. Elena touched down hard as the damaged landing gear absorbed impact forces that tested every structural component. Her aircraft finally coming to rest on a runway where medical teams waited to receive casualties, whose lives had been saved through capabilities everyone insisted she didn't have. Taliban forces had demonstrated exactly the coordination Elena had documented, while intelligence officers maintained denial even as evidence proved their assessments wrong. Her unauthorized rescue had succeeded through preparation that was dismissed as paranoia and expertise that was considered beyond cargo pilot qualifications, proving that institutional assumptions often mattered less than individual competence and determination. Medical teams swarmed Elena's battle-damaged C-130 before the engines had fully spun down. Emergency personnel working with desperate efficiency to evacuate casualties, who arrived alive because someone had ignored orders that would have left them to die. Stretchers emerged from the cargo compartment carrying wounded personnel whose survival validated every unauthorized decision Elena had made during a mission that officially should never have been attempted. Dr. Sarah Williams supervised the casualty evacuation with clinical precision. Her earlier concerns about Elena's psychological fitness replaced by professional focus on trauma cases that required immediate surgical intervention. 2 soldiers with penetrating abdominal wounds were rushed directly to the operating theater where military surgeons began procedures that would save lives everyone else had written off as acceptable losses. Elena remained in her pilot's seat as the evacuation proceeded around her, hands shaking with delayed stress reaction. Now that adrenaline was wearing off and the reality of what she'd accomplished began settling into her consciousness. She'd flown a combat rescue mission through coordinated Taliban defenses that intelligence officers insisted didn't exist, proving that preparation could overcome institutional denial when lives hung in the balance. Lieutenant Colonel Stone appeared at the base of her aircraft, flanked by military police officers whose presence suggested that Elena's career-ending consequences would be swift and decisive. His face showed a mixture of rage and confusion as he processed the contradiction between Elena's successful rescue and his assumptions about cargo pilot capabilities and Taliban coordination. Captain Vasquez, step out of that aircraft immediately. Stone ordered with authority that sounded hollow after Elena had just accomplished what he'd declared impossible. You are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, conducting unauthorized combat operations, and endangering military personnel through reckless action. Elena climbed down from her cockpit on unsteady legs, facing Stone with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout weeks of institutional dismissal. The battle damage covering her aircraft told the story of Taliban coordination that intelligence assessments had refused to acknowledge, validation written in bullet holes and shrapnel scars that couldn't be explained away through bureaucratic interpretation. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived at the flight line with an entourage that included the base commander and medical personnel, whose preliminary reports were already contradicting official threat assessments. Hayes studied Elena's aircraft with the analytical gaze of someone reassessing previous assumptions about pilot capabilities and enemy coordination. Commander Stone, Hayes said with authority that stopped the arrest procedure mid-process. I need to understand how a cargo pilot successfully conducted medical evacuation through hostile territory where authorized rescue attempts failed completely. Stone's confidence evaporated as he struggled to explain Elena's success without acknowledging the validity of warnings he'd systematically dismissed. "Ma'am, Captain Vasquez violated direct orders and conducted unauthorized operations that endangered personnel through reckless disregard for proper procedures." Hayes turned to Elena with questions that would determine not just individual consequences, but institutional policy regarding intelligence assessment and pilot utilization. "Captain, explain how you identified Taliban positions that our intelligence apparatus missed and executed rescue operations that qualified personnel declared impossible." Elena provided a detailed debrief that documented months of pattern recognition and preparation while intelligence professionals maintained denial about threats that had materialized, exactly as she'd predicted. Her analysis revealed systematic failures in institutional threat assessment that had endangered personnel and compromised operational effectiveness through willful ignorance of observable enemy capabilities. Major Fletcher arrived as Elena concluded her briefing, his intelligence assessment delivered with diminished confidence as the scope of institutional failure became apparent. "Ma'am, preliminary analysis suggests that enemy coordination was more sophisticated than our initial assessments indicated. Captain Vasquez appears to have identified patterns that weren't apparent through standard intelligence channels." The admission represented complete reversal of Fletcher's previous positions about Elena's intelligence capabilities and Taliban coordination, institutional acknowledgement that cargo pilots could observe and analyze threats that professional intelligence officers had missed. Hayes listened with expressions that suggested significant changes in personnel assignments and operational procedures. 3 weeks later, Elena sat in the same operations center where her warnings had been dismissed, reading orders that transferred her to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, with assignment as Senior Tactical Intelligence Officer for Combat Rescue Operations. Her unauthorized mission had been officially classified as exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. Her intelligence methods incorporated into standard threat assessment procedures. Stone had been relieved of command and transferred to administrative duties where his inability to process contradictory information couldn't endanger operational personnel. Fletcher faced formal investigation for intelligence failures that had nearly resulted in catastrophic losses of personnel and equipment through systematic denial of observable threat patterns. The wounded soldiers Elena had evacuated made complete recoveries, their survival testimony to the value of preparation that others had dismissed as unnecessary paranoia. Razor 6 personnel stationed at FOB Mitchell requested Elena as their preferred extraction specialist for future operations requiring navigation through hostile territory. Elena's C-130 had been repaired and upgraded with enhanced defensive systems that reflected lessons learned from unauthorized modifications that had proven essential for survival in combat environments. Her aircraft bore mission marks that documented successful operations in conditions where conventional wisdom insisted success was impossible. Taliban coordination capabilities were now officially acknowledged in intelligence assessments that incorporated Elena's analytical methods and observational techniques. Her pattern recognition protocols became standard training for intelligence personnel who'd previously dismissed pilot observations as unreliable anecdotal evidence. The fog of institutional denial had lifted, replaced by recognition that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources and that preparation mattered more than rank when facing situations that demanded competence over compliance with procedures that hadn't anticipated reality's complexity. 6 months later, Elena stood before a new class of cargo pilots at the Special Operations Aviation School, her instructor uniform bearing ribbons that told the story of missions flown against impossible odds. The young aviators listened with rapt attention as she described pattern recognition techniques and threat assessment methods that had saved lives when Institutional wisdom failed. Remember, Elena told her students, expertise isn't determined by rank or assignment. It's built through preparation, observation, and the courage to trust your analysis even when everyone else disagrees. The Taliban taught me that enemies don't respect our organizational charts or our assumptions about what cargo pilots are supposed to know. Her classroom walls displayed satellite photos of the Taliban positions she'd identified, tactical diagrams that illustrated coordination patterns intelligence officers had missed, and mission reports that documented successful operations flown by pilots everyone had underestimated. Elena's students would graduate with capabilities that transcended traditional cargo pilot training, prepared for combat realities rather than peacetime assumptions. After class, Elena walked to her new aircraft, a specially modified C-130, equipped with advanced defensive systems and intelligence gathering equipment. Her crew chief, now Master Sergeant Santos, conducted pre-flight inspections with the same meticulous attention to detail that had kept them alive during unauthorized missions that changed everything. Elena had proven that being called just a cargo pilot was only an insult if you accepted limitations others tried to impose. Sometimes the most important missions were flown by people others dismissed, and sometimes expertise emerged from unexpected places when institutions failed to recognize competence that didn't fit predetermined categories. If this story of courage against impossible odds inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. We share real stories of people who refuse to accept limitations and prove that determination conquers doubt. What's your impossible mission? Share your story in the comments below. You might be our next featured hero. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss another incredible journey of triumph against all odds.